Welcome to No One is Competent, the premier history podcast dedicated to demonstrating how bad every important person was at their job. My name is Azalea, and I'm joined by Jay. We hope everyone listening to this is having a safe and pleasant holiday season, which we know is a challenge for most. Jay, it's a challenge for you now, isn't it?
Yeah, if you're wondering why this episode is a little bit late, it's because
Jay was smited. Smited!
Yeah, it turns out that, I can't open my mouth fully at the moment without it feeling like somebody is, poking a needle into my ear.
Jay literally got a 2 injured 2 podcast doctor's note.
It's what they call a TMJ, I think, strain or disorder. But basically, if I open my mouth all the way, it hurts. When you're talking, you don't open your jaw all the way normally, but if I talk for too long, it starts kind of hurting anyways.
I really hope that you get better before you lose your job at the dick sucking factory. That sounds really bad.
Yeah, it might be a little bit problematic for that.
So hopefully this episode is out. As when you get this episode, know that we put it out as soon as we could put it out, and the next ones will hopefully be on the regular schedule, as if this one was out on time. I don't fucking know. We don't get paid for this content. We have no sponsors. We have no advertisements. We have no deep state connections, despite the many spurious allegations. So we would really appreciate if y'all would head on down to your podcasting app of choice, platform, whatever. You're already on it because you're listening to this. Type in a 5-star review or a recommendation or a like or a subscribe or whatever. Just, take the algorithm and diddle it. Diddle the algorithm for us. All right, tell a friend. Tell us that we're funny and cool and cute and that we have good hair and make excellent life decisions and totally aren't spiraling into a mental health crisis. No, you're spiraling into a mental health crisis. Shut up. Yeah, you can follow us on Twitter at Jaharies48 and at Azalea Wyatt, and you can reach out to us at nooneiscompetent@gmail.com. Please hit us with episode requests, suggestions. If you're bored, I don't know. Ask us strange riddles. But if it's any compensation for us being late, I think we got something pretty special for the people today. Don't we, Jay?
Yeah, this is a little bit of an unusual one for us. Trying out the new format.
Yes, this is a 3-parter episode. It is not a series. It is one episode that was so long, we had to break it into 3 parts. We thought this would be convenient to put out content on the Christmas, holiday, New Year season, which was difficult for us last year because we both, contrary to popular belief, have social circles and families that we do things with and take up vast swaths of our time around the winter solstice. So, kind of wanted to get the content locked down. So we are going through every American president. All 45 of the 46 presidents. God, I fucking hate that.
Cleveland really ruined it for everyone.
It's just, they didn't have to do that. Okay, they could say that he's still the 22nd president because he was still the 22nd person to be. God, I hate non-autistic people. Fuck. Ah! I'm actually upset. Anyway, we're going to do every American president, and we're going to highlight some sort of incompetence or failure. Now, Jay can attest to this, because this is mostly my fault, but This episode was supposed to be like easy,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
The whole thing was like, oh, we had this idea for a long time. I was convinced for a while that we could just do a fun little light trivia episode where we could just name a silly, funny, incompetent thing that happened with every presidential administration. And then I started writing, and well, then suddenly the doc was like 24 pages long. And I was like,
Turns out, scripts often have a way of just getting away from you.
Yeah, so instead of throwing out like little trivia tidbits like, oh, Grover Cleveland's Treasury Secretary was fired after he was caught having sex with his nephew or something, I don't know. We are going to like actually kind of talk about a sort of incompetence or failure. And the rules are that incompetence or failure must occur either while they are in office, running for office, or attempting to get reelected. Nothing directly outside of the presidency.
Now, this failure can be a mistake they directly made or something that was allowed to happen under their administration. It can also be a sort of general failure of politics at the time that they just embodied. It can also be something that happened to them or a side effect of their existence. Sometimes it's just funny hypocrisy. Now, we tried hard to keep this varied. It's not all just bad appointments or diplomatic bungling. We'll jump from petty issues to massive events of statecraft. We also tried our best not to mention the obvious things about every president. We want you all to actually learn something from this. And when we do hit the obvious scandal, we'll try to come at it from a unique angle.
It's the most awkward y'all that a human being has ever made. You live in fucking Maryland, bro. Like, learn the word. Anyway, along the way, we'll probably talk freehand about the nature of the presidency and how we regard all of these guys. The United States has a pretty good presidential situation, Jay, because like 45 dudes, it's a big number, it's a sizable number, but it's small enough that you can do things with it. You can make them into groups.
It's not like
cut them into distinct eras.
He's not going through like the Roman emperors or something.
Yeah, it's not the Roman emperors. It's not the British. I wouldn't want to do this with the British prime ministers.
Oh yeah, those go back pretty far away.
I wouldn't want to do this with the Italian prime ministers. But it's interesting how the presidency, the United States was, the first modern attempt at a constitutional democracy. And the institution of the president is not one that was super heavily imitated across the world. Other countries have presidents. Most of them function differently.
Yes. Most presidents in parliamentary systems, more or less, are a replacement for the old monarch, meaning that they kind of have symbolic power, but generally pretty limited.
Which I don't understand the point of, but whatever. And then you have places like France that does have a parliament but doesn't have a prime minister. They have a president. I don't fucking who cares? Anyway, the American presidency was an attempt to create a king, a democratically elected head of state, a ruler for a country that had rejected rulers, which created a lot of inherent tension. And then there's the fact that what the U.S. government does, and therefore what the president does, is changes massively over time. And the presidency heads the executive branch. And for a long time, there just was not a lot of things to execute. And then we started adding stuff to execute. That kind of leads to this weird inflection point in history where we suddenly go from presidents not having anything to do to suddenly having so much to do that they can't possibly control everything that's happening in their own branch. And it functions mostly independently of them, and sometimes with complete disregard for their own will.
It's always nice when that happens.
Yes, the actual deep state. Fucking pencil neck Mormons in Langley. Alright, so obviously we're going to go in alphabetical order, but reverse alphabet? No, we're going to go in chronological order. Alright! George Washington. So I would argue that the office of the presidency doesn't exist without Washington, or at least it would be very different without him. The role was custom made for him, and everyone had him in mind while designing the presidency. Now see, the folks who drafted the Constitution all hated each other, for very good reasons. I mean, they were assholes, and were quickly sorting themselves into competing interests. They did this despite the fact that they were making a constitution that was only designed to work if political parties did not exist. Washington was the only person any of them could agree on as a suitable leader. He was universally beloved and therefore beyond politics. You know, these are kinds of guys who only come about once or twice in a country's history. Once a century. Guys like, this is the same, Ataturk, Napoleon, the founding father, this sort of mythological figure, a Romulus for a nation that all of our politics sort of revolves around and is therefore beyond the bickerings of the system. At least that's the intent. And the idea was, by giving Washington the presidency, the founding fathers could bring the new nation into the world without sin. Washington was not a politician. They didn't want this to be political. So if we give it to him, we can start things off clean.
Now, this worked in terms of the U.S. continuing to be a thing, but it failed by all other metrics. Washington did not stop political controversies from occurring because the political questions remained unanswered, and there existed within the American elite different economic interests. So Washington spends most of his terms slouched behind his desk as a bunch of New York debate club dweebs yelled at slave-owning poli-sci nerds. And he eventually started siding with Hamilton and Adams because they wanted him to do things, and he kind of enjoyed doing things. So the political peace that Washington was supposed to ensure never came. It could never come, of course, but what's fun is that Washington had hated politics his entire life, and it was his final crowning legendary achievement which turned him into a political figure. It seems you can't win them all.
If you read his writings, Washington is very obsessed during his life with his legacy and how he's going to be perceived. And if you look at his career, obviously he had been in politics even before the Revolutionary War, but he was kind of did it because he was so rich he had to do it. He didn't like doing it. He found it. It's just personality matrix. He just didn't care that much about political issues, and also didn't like hurting people's feelings like that and being disliked, and it bored him. He's the jock.
Yeah.
This was not his field. And suddenly the French Revolution is happening, and the U.S. has to decide what to do with their former ally, and Jefferson's yelling one thing, and Hamilton's yelling another thing, and he's just like, Will you people just be quiet? Jay, you got any Washington presidency takes?
Presidency
It's
takes
weirdly inactive.
Yeah, like it's it's hard to have a strong opinion of him as president. I know a lot of people love George Washington. I know he's your favorite. I'm pretty sure. At least as a person.
Is he?
Not necessarily as a president, but as just like an individual. But
no, I mean he's pretty boring. I mean the dude died because like he was out in the cold too long, but then he didn't take off his wet overcoat because he wanted to properly greet his guests first, and then he got pneumonia.
I just remember you liking a lot of the stories of him like dancing and stuff like that.
I mean, I compared to most of the presidents, he seems like one of the ones that you'd want to hang out with the most.
Yeah, the
you
good
drink
old,
a beer with him.
The good old George W. Bush metric. Yep. No, I don't
Top
have
tier
strong opinions on Washington. I view him more as a military leader, as a general, than I do as a president. And as a general, he had plenty of positives and plenty of negatives as well.
I actually think that Washington is like weirdly underrated as a general, but that's a different podcast.
Yeah.
Anyway, number 2, John Adams. So John Adams gets in, and if the Washington idea was we're going to subvert political differences by sort of just putting a cooler on everything. Washington was the thing that makes politics goes away. The politics, just like putting a lid on a pot, you just make it boil faster. And as soon as John Adams gets in there, whew, Adams was Washington's vice president, but had none of the stature or love of his predecessor. And once the brake pad of Washington was taken off, American politics careened into rabid name-calling.
Now, Adams found himself on the receiving end of a torrent of negative press from newspapers owned by the allies of Thomas Jefferson, who was his main political rival. These papers accused Adams of weakness and cowardice. They called him a hermaphrodite. One book, which was essentially a Jefferson-funded attack piece, called Adams a repulsive pedant, a gross hypocrite, and an unprincipled oppressor. You don't really need to know what these political debates were over. It's all 18th century, yada yada. But people at the time were really pissed off over all of that stuff.
So Adams, so infuriated that he's not being treated as respectfully as his predecessor, gets Congress to pass the Sedition Act, which made it illegal to make, quote, false or malicious statements about the government. Now, this is both obviously unconstitutional and impossible to enforce. In fact, it mostly wasn't enforced and made Adams even more of a laughingstock because everyone was just like, bro, this is stupid. But it is now an important historical fact that you can just read laid out on Wikipedia that one Luther Baldwin of Newark, New Jersey was once fined $100 for remarking of the gun salutes of a parade Adams was attending. I hope it hits Adams in the arse. Anyway, Adams lost re-election and the Sedition Act was repealed basically immediately. What I think is funny about the whole episode is that the country, we are like 10 years into the modern, like 1798 is 10, 11 years into the modern country in the Constitution existing. And we are already being like, oh, freedom of speech. Let's just check that in the garbage. And obviously, if you look historically, like these days, freedom of speech, it's kind of a meme of how important people think it is.
Yeah.
It was not given that primacy in people's minds and hearts. during this period, but it's still hilarious just how quickly that ideal got thrown in the trash because people are mean to you. And I've even heard that privately in his letters corresponding to Adams that Washington fully supported most of his measures and was like, yeah, fucking take the gloves off.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Now that brings us to one of the other famous guys, Thomas Jefferson.
Possibly the hardest dude to write about.
Yeah. Jefferson has long been seen as a bit of an enigmatic and contradictory figure. I mean, that's reflected in the name of the source for this section of the podcast, which is American Sphinx by Joseph Ellis. Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. He was the main author of it, but he owned a bunch of slaves. He praised the natives to a pretty great extent, but he authorized some of the first formal acts of Indian removal in American history. He opposed a strong executive government, yet wielded his executive powers with great authority once in office. And Jefferson is the first president who supposedly disliked concentrating executive power.
And that's his that's his incompetence, is that Jefferson is the guy who belays the lie of the office. There actually is like one U.S. president who did not like expanding the powers of the president and showed restraint. And once we get to him, you're gonna hate him. You're gonna find him so fucking annoying. I'm not gonna tell you who it is, but there's one guy, and he sucked.
Yeah. That political yada yada we mentioned earlier. Basically, Jefferson was what we call a Democratic Republican or just a Republican. These guys wanted a weaker central government and a weaker executive. They also generally liked France. The Federalists, on the other hand, liked a strong central government and powerful executive, and they were generally pretty favorable towards the United Kingdom.
So despite Jefferson's massive amount of political capital in this era, like everyone knew Jefferson was eventually going to be president once the presidency became a thing. It was his wealth and influence made it inevitable. He was not particularly charismatic, and he held a disdain for public speaking. 8 years in the presidency, 2 public speeches, because he got inaugurated twice. He wrote letters to Congress instead of appearing before them annually, a tradition established by his predecessors, and he viewed writing as more efficient than speaking. And to his credit, that's because he's one of America's most famous writers. While Jefferson likely would not have made it far in just about any later point in American history, to us he is interesting in that he is perhaps the first, but certainly not the last, president to enter office with a strong, well-defined ideology and moral code, and then promptly shove it in the toilet for the sake of pure pragmatism. Washington was never as ideological as Jefferson. He had his beliefs, but they were less vested in the political debates of the era, kind of vague aphorisms. Adams was a Federalist who basically extended Federalist ideas to their extreme with the Sedition Act. Jefferson, however, completely contradicted his own small government, anti-imperial presidency ideals. And, this is because of the thing he's most famous for, Louisiana Purchase.
Now, the collapse of French control over their colony of Saint-Domingue, that being Haiti, in the early 1800s, led to Napoleon.
That's a really interesting thing that happened in history. That's a fascinating little episode. Someone should do like a really in-depth breakdown on how that happened in like 8 weeks or so.
Could be interesting, yeah. But yeah, the French are done in Haiti, and this means that Napoleon loses interest in France's North American Empire and agrees to sell the entire Louisiana territory to the United States in 1803 to help fund his wars in Europe. I think most of our listeners are American and know this, but if you're not, the Louisiana Territory is not just the state of Louisiana. It's basically like the entire central United States.
Is basically from the Mississippi River to, at the time, like, minus Texas, Nebraska, the rest of a third of the continent, the middle third of the continent. It was vague and dumb because it's not like any of these countries actually control this territory, which is a separate rant. But it's like the middle third of the continent.
Yeah. Now, this acquisition, which basically doubled the size of the United States, was negotiated by the executive branch working completely on its own accord. Jefferson wanted the land for the United States, and he didn't want anything to get in the way. Now, his fellow Republican politicians, like James Madison, expressed that such a vast change to the nation should have a legal basis in a constitutional amendment, and Jefferson initially agreed with this. However, upon hearing news that Napoleon was having second thoughts about the whole deal, Jefferson decided to speed it along. In his own words, quote, "The less that is said about my constitutional difficulty, the better, and that it will be desirable for Congress to do what is necessary in silence."
And it's worth noting that the Louisiana Purchase, the amount of money per acre that France was asking was dumb. It was just stupid cheap. Like to not take the deal. I mean, these days in American politics, politicians are lauded for refusing massive dump trucks of money getting dumped on their state. But this is back in the time when you were actually expected to improve the nation, given the opportunity. And it was just too tempting a deal to pass up. In the end, Jefferson was able to push the Louisiana Purchase through Congress after minimal debate. The terms of the purchase gave the executive branch a vast amount of power over the administration of the territory. As Senator John Quincy Adams put it, Thomas Jefferson now wielded more direct power over the residents of its half of the United States than King George III ever wielded over the colonists. Jefferson's early proposal for the governance of this territory included a presidentially appointed governor ruling through a assembly of notables, akin to that of the Ancien Regime of France. In the author of the Declaration of Independence's mind, such an action was justified, as the French, Creole, and native peoples of the territory were not mentally ready for self-governance. In any case, Jefferson's abandonment of his earlier ideals in pursuit of the Louisiana Territory worked, and to this day, the purchase remains one of the most important executive actions in American history. This is Thomas Jefferson we're talking about. He liked contradicting himself almost as much as he liked raping 14-year-olds. Like, what do you expect out of the guy?
Yeah.
I feel like everyone knows the whole, like, he had kids of his slave thing.
Yeah.
But, like, people don't know the she was 14 part. Which, like, feels almost equally important.
Yeah. Kind of. Yeah, not a upstanding individual. But you know, he got his face on the rock, so that's what counts.
He's on the $2 bill.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen a $2 bill in person?
I own a $2 bill.
Cool. I own 4. I work retail.
Yeah. I remember just getting one as a child and like just keeping it.
I mean, they're cool. I mean, like, they have a full, like, big painting on the bag.
Yeah.
I mean, it's objectively dumb. It's not the worst thing about U.S. currency by far, but, like, we have a weird, like, joke currency, kind of, that you almost can't use.
Yeah.
Like, you know, Jay, I know you have never worked retail because, you know, you're a member of the ruling class of this country, but the computer programs that you operate a cash register on, the vast majority of them don't even have an option for a $2 bill. So what most retail workers end up doing, including myself, is you just take out your wallet, take out 2 of your own dollars, and swap it out. So the system can fucking function. And that's what your manager will probably, that's what my manager first told me to do. Sound off in the YouTube comments or shoot me an email, retail workers, if you got any weird $2 bill stories.
Or if you're from a country that has as inexplicable of a banknote as the $2 bill.
Number 4, James Madison.
There's a good argument for declaring James Madison the biggest poli-sci nerd out of all the American presidents, mostly in competition with Woodrow Wilson. Madison was the main author of the Constitution and is regarded as one of the principal founding fathers, despite, how he kind of lived in Jefferson's shadow. The two were aligned philosophically, and both came from Virginia, and Madison followed up Jefferson as president. He's also the guy who kind of got the White House burned down.
Womp, womp, womp.
Yeah, you see, Madison oversaw the War of 1812, where the U.S. got kind of massively owned by Britain and Canada, and were only spared from repercussions because of how tired Britain was from dealing with Napoleon. The whole story is a podcast episode in and of itself, and we want to just tell a mere snippet of it today. You see, Madison helped encourage the war, seeing Canada as ripe for the taking. It's kind of funny how, a lot of the early founding fathers just naturally assumed that, Canada was just going to be a part of the U.S. It's just going to happen.
Yes, totally was why wouldn't they?
Yeah. But yeah, this turned out to be incorrect, and the invasion of Canada went awfully. Indian tribes rose up to attack a weakened America, and the British began landing troops in the Chesapeake Bay.
In August of 1814, Madison went down with the American army to try and check the British advance. What followed was the Battle of Bladensburg, where Madison actively contributed to an American defeat and almost got himself captured. Again, we have to reiterate, Madison is a writer. He is a dork. He is a man of letters, to put it politely. He was very important, he was very rich, but he wasn't even super charismatic amongst his political faction. Again, he got in after Thomas Jefferson, and he's 63 years old when this goes down, with no military experience whatsoever. And despite this, he decided to make himself the only American president to ever command troops in the field during their presidency. Now, this is a fun fact you'll find a lot, but digging through a lot of sources, I could not find many of Madison's direct orders to soldiers. I think it's rather that he had the authority to issue orders, but there were actual generals and officers there who were mostly doing that. Rather, he was just a massive liability to the actual commanders on site. At one point, he apparently got turned around and almost rode his horse towards enemy lines before a scout flagged him down. Yeah, he was gonna cross the wrong bridge, and 1,000 yards, the other way is a town occupied by the British. He and his escort just got turned around, and guy was like, no, get back here. Kind of reminds me of playing Capture the Flag and shit as a kid.
Yeah.
Someone's gonna fuck it up, except instead of Capture the Flag, it's people shooting at each other. He really feels like a guy playing at war if you read the sources. And once the shooting starts, he's totally useless. He gives some ineffectual orders, may have contradicted himself. Again, there's not a lot of direct documentation of what those orders may have been. American leadership at Bladensburg was incompetent even beyond him, but I'm sure having to babysit the ruler of the country didn't make things any easier.
Yeah. And the defeat at Bladensburg is what allowed the British to sack D.C., and they really could have easily captured Madison, who put himself and much of his cabinet at risk for no reason at all.
I want you to imagine, like, if FDR just, like, went to the Battle of the Bulge because, like, he just wanted to hang out.
Yeah.
Like, think about it for 4 seconds.
Yeah.
And I guess the logic is, like, that it would have been, proper for him to go, that he would inspire the men or actively contribute. But, I mean, if you play chess, there's a reason you don't advance the king very often.
Yeah. I think, like, at this point, some of the presidents, at least Madison, might still have had like romantic ideas of the American Revolution, even though it wasn't that long ago. And like, like that they're like the, like the yeoman leaders who will go with the militia to fight the British, and did not work well. And yeah, every president after this avoids battle as much as possible. So I think Lincoln got like close to battle like once or twice, but that was about it.
Especially if you're 63, which is essentially 102 back then.
Yeah.
And have no idea how combat works.
Yeah. I mean, most European monarchs had like given up personally leading troops in battle like a century or two ago. It's not a good idea unless you're Napoleon.
It's just hilarious that the only U.S. president who actively tried to get shit done in a battle was one of the ones who wasn't one of the many generals and military officers to be an American president. It was a fucking debate club dweeb who was cosplaying a ruler.
Yeah. And then to continue on with the Jeffersonian dweebs, we have James Monroe. James Monroe was the last of the founding fathers to serve as president, and as mentioned, he's the third Jeffersonian Virginian in a row, a copy of a copy. What we're saying is that he's pretty boring, as presidency is kind of the most boring part of his life. It's not to say that stuff didn't happen, it just didn't involve Monroe all that much. Partially because the guy seemed to have little interest in doing anything at all. Monroe's the first president to oversee an honest-to-God financial crash, this being the Panic of 1819.
I'm leaving that in. Fuck you.
The panic happened because, all the economic stuff. It's an economic slowdown after the war and blah, blah, blah. The weakness of the American banking system as well, and, whatever land speculations. Throw it all in the bag. It doesn't really matter for us today why it happened. It's just you need to know that Monroe set the precedent for the federal government doing basically fuck all to address the problem. Congress was in recess when the financial crash began, and prominent business leaders called on Monroe to call a special session of Congress. He declined. Once Congress did reconvene, Monroe recommended raising a tariff to affect the economy, but he did not recommend a rate, and he couldn't have been too forceful about it because Congress wouldn't put a new tariff in place for 4 years.
It's wild to think about how limited both the government and the presidency was thought of in the early days. They legit thought big problems weren't really their concern. And what's wild is that Monroe suffered no consequences for this. He ran for re-election unopposed. This is that era of good feelings that if you're an American, you learned about. That's a vocab word that you had in your class in 11th grade. The era of good feelings. Guy got all but a single protest electoral vote. All right. This is the guy who almost unanimously re-elected. Basically did nothing. Man, we need higher standards in this country. By the way, Monroe, also at the Battle of Bladensburg, also did not do well, despite the fact that he actually had some military experience. Yeah. And I think he was Secretary of War at the time. And the guy did so little, like he actually spent part of his presidency going on like a goodwill tour to just wave at people. Because he was kind of a mascot for the country.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, you could kind of argue that could be a good thing, but if you have a mascot, you also need a dude who actually does things.
I mean, that was the whole kind of point of that Jeffersonian republicanism, and we kind of mentioned how Jefferson put it aside to get the Louisiana Purchase, but apart from, when they wanted to do stuff like that, they kind of just chilled in Washington, D.C., which also at this point is just like a couple of buildings surrounded by like swamp. Like the U.S. doesn't really have a capital at this point, not in the way people think of it. People talk about like visitors to the U.S. like got lost and would be like, hey, where's Washington? And people would be like, oh, you're inside of it. Because it's just like a couple of buildings and a bunch of open land. In some of the early sessions of Congress, they would be interrupted by the sounds of people just shooting waterfowl outside.
The tight-knit nature of DC is actually going to become important momentarily. But first, number 6, John Quincy Adams, the first presidential son to sit as president. Took fucking 6 guys to get a repeat. And it goes to show that this country was thrown together by a ruling class of approximately 58 dudes and their kids. There just was not a lot of the ruling class founding fathers. And they all knew each other, and they all talked to each other, and they all gossiped about each other. JQA is actually one of the more fascinating presidents you can study. He's the first guy on this list I find actually interesting. Washington is kind of fun to say every once in a while, but John Quincy Adams seems like a mind that, obviously I don't respect him, but I could respect him if I was like, a liberal. Oh, that'd be awful, wouldn't it? The man had an extensive resume before taking office, and would go on to be arguably much more important after he left. The before and after are significant, but not really the during. Seriously, look up what John Quincy Adams did after being president. There's a lot of hilarious shit in there. So, for our entry, JQA is the first real the throne is a prison president. He's the first guy who you really have to feel bad for, if you have the capacity to do that, for having the job. Yes, his father, John Adams, was miserable much of the time, but he got to do things, and he brought most of that on himself. Junior would not get the privilege. Junior spent his presidency unable to get anything done, but watching all of his hard work come to nothing. Before Jay takes it over, this is a guy who was a diplomat. He was well read. He was well wrote. He was respected. He was refined. He had been all over the world. He had been in political office most of his life. He was ready for this. And then he had an awful time as president.
Yeah, and the reason for all of this is because of how he got elected. You see, back in 1824, the political parties hadn't been fully formalized, and we had a 4-way race between Adams, Andrew Jackson, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. Obviously, no one got a majority of either the popular vote or the Electoral College, so the vote went to the House of Representatives. And after a while of backroom negotiation, it was decided that Adams would be president number 6, with Clay as his Secretary of State. Henry Clay was Speaker of the House at this point, so yeah, it doesn't really look good. Jackson and his camp were furious. Jackson had won the largest share of the popular and electoral votes, but had lost the backroom dealing. This would thus be dubbed the corrupt bargain. Adams entered office wildly unpopular both with the people and with the new Congress, who proceeded to shoot down most of his agenda. Adams had an ambitious interpretation of the Constitution and thought he had a path to make the U.S. into a powerful modern state, but almost everything he suggested failed to pass. It's really a fun story that could be its own episode. A brilliant mind who rises to power with a Machiavellian power play, only to wind up basically moot as a ruler. Gonna Vortigern vibes from him.
Yeah, no, that's part of the reason Adams is fun. Adams, Van Buren, and like H.W. Bush are the three dudes. I mean, H.W. probably had the best run, but the three dudes who are like the political geniuses of their time who finally get in the car, get to drive the presidency, and just eat shit.
Yeah.
And it's great. We're a big part of this first part is going to be the history of American political parties. And in many ways, the story of the presidency is the story of the political parties. We spoke before about how the Constitution wasn't designed with political parties in mind and how parties kind of broke the system. And we kind of talked about how the first parties were just Hamilton and his friends yelling at Jefferson and his friends. But after that, even though parties break the system, like, it takes a while to formally form parties. And that's gonna affect things going forward. Also, I kind of want to say now, we reserve the right to turn all of these things into expanded episodes, and the phrase, a thing we can make an entire episode about, is something you will hear often. So anyway, Adams's election and presidency were so toxic and controversial that it basically forced the system to adopt formal political parties in response. Which leads us to number 7, Andrew Jackson. So Jackson comes back in 1828 with a much better organized campaign, organized partially by a dude named Martin Van Buren, who we'll talk about in a second, for a rematch of Adams that was so bitter it basically invented modern attack ads. Like, Jackson's team would insult basically they just called Adams a nerd, and oh, he just reads books all day. Meanwhile, Adams's camp called Jackson like a butcher and a cannibal.
I mean, probably not too far off the truth.
In either direction.
Yeah.
But some of these slanders were directed at Jackson's wife, Rachel Jackson, on account of her being divorced before marrying him, which, of course, was scandalous at the time. This is 1828. Now, Rachel died of a stroke just 7 weeks after the election, and her husband blamed the stress of the campaign for her death at her funeral, publicly swearing never to forgive Adams and his associates. This is the context you need for the Peggy Eaton affair. One of the more hilarious episodes in this podcast. As we previously mentioned, Washington, D.C. was a small town at this point. The place was purpose-built to be a capital, which means you have to start building it, which means it's going to start small. Everyone knows each other, and all of the cabinet secretaries' wives all hang out and socialize because, you know, there's no one else for high-class ladies to socialize with, and they do, I don't know, cocktail parties or book clubs or compared latte art, whatever the fuck 19th century rich ladies did. And Jackson's Secretary of War had a wife named Peggy Eaton, who had also been married once before, just like Rachel had been, and was thus surrounded by rumors of promiscuity, some of which are probably true, which caused the other wives to shun her. Now, Jackson sees this, thinks of his wife, Rachel, and gets PTSD flashbacks, in contrast to all of that Indian genocide that Jackson did, which seems to have caused no PTSD flashbacks at all. Now, before you ask, because I can see you, Greg, I can see your little fucking face. I know what you're thinking. Andrew and Peggy were friends. Peggy had been close to Rachel before her death, and we have zero evidence that her and Andrew had any sort of sexual relationship. Seems to be more of a father-daughter thing. Andrew Jackson was actually pretty old during his presidency. People forget about that. Jackson seems to have been genuinely concerned for this woman, her social life, and her mental health, which all leads to the President of the United States interrupting cabinet meetings to bring up the affairs of his cabinet's wives. This goes on for months, and soon there are meetings being called where the only item on the agenda is Peggy Eaton.
Now, if this doesn't really sound like a big deal, we want you to imagine if Joe Biden called his vice president, his chief of staff, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and all 18 cabinet secretaries into a room, only to complain that the granddaughter of the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development is getting cyberbullied by the other presidential granddaughters on TikTok and asking them what is to be done about it. Needless to say, all of this led to Jackson distancing himself from most of his cabinet, thus allowing a little fox from Kinderhook named Martin Van Buren to whisper in his ear.
See, here's the thing that makes this so hilarious to me. Because Jackson is known in popular imagination as, the badass general president. Oh yeah, sure, he was mean and brutal, but he was a hard man. He's old hickory. They try, he got shot in a duel and, hero of the Battle of New Orleans.
Got slashed in the face as a child.
And here he is, just literally making gossip the chief matter of state. We have transcripts of him screaming about this over the course of months. This massively affects the party, and which cabinet ministers are on the in and on the outs with him. And imagine how many people sabotaged their political careers because their wives are I don't care what you tell me, I ain't hanging out with that bitch, she a hoe.
Yeah.
And this was real.
Yeah. Though I think you can say that a lot of people probably would have been better off if Jackson spent his entire presidency just embroiled in gossip rather than doing anything else.
That is fair. No damage was being done during this time. I don't know, the two other big things for Jackson are Indian removal, which is obviously heinous, and then getting through nullification, where, he probably delayed the Civil War, so...
That's true. He did also kill the National Bank, which, is neither here nor there.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that in the next one that you're about to read.
Yeah. So that brings us on to the aforementioned Martin Van Buren. Now, before I say this, why is Martin Van Buren an obvious race, Dan?
I have this written in the script. I don't know why I even have to argue this. Look at the guy.
I just don't know much about him.
Martin Van Buren is the most obvious race stan we've had as president. Woodrow Wilson is obviously the most obvious Oscar stan we've ever had as president. Second runner-up being Donald Trump. Bisato, obviously the fandom is kind of split between Taft and Harding off the top of my head. But yeah, I don't know, Van Buren, he's a nerd, but he's a guy, he's a gossip, and he was really good with ladies. He famously had a correspondence with dozens of other men's wives, and this was his thing that he was known for, and it was considered endearing that he would sort of flirtily exchange letters with your wife. But also, he was a nerd who set up a whole political party. I don't know. Look at his facial hair. His whole vibe just screams race stan.
Right,
and also, most of our listeners have no idea what we're talking about. So we should probably move on.
Yeah, I'll take your word for it. So Van Buren's another figure like John Quincy Adams, who could have an whole episode.
Let's not pretend that Ava waifu debates are not like 1700% vibe based.
Yeah. This guy could have a whole episode, but the short explanation of him is that he was the architect of the Democrat Party. He put together a patriotism network, secured votes, and made sure that those who got elected were loyal to him. He was kind of like the George H.W. Bush of his time, the guy who spent his whole life as a party operative, working his way through the ranks, living in the shadow of a president popular with the masses. Bush had Reagan and Van Buren had Jackson. And he's finally given the highest office in the land, only to shit the bed. Van Buren takes office in March of 37, and 2 months later, the Panic of 1837 starts. Again, this could be a whole episode, and you were probably lied to about this in school. We actually briefly tried making an episode on this and ran into
Behind the curtain, folks.
Yeah. Turns out neither of us really were taught this very well in school.
Turns out sometimes a push lies, and it doesn't matter that you got a 5 on the test.
But yeah. Basically, a bubble of cotton prices and land speculation burst, European banks cut credit, and America's weak banking system collapsed, a banking system that Jackson had intentionally weakened, as we mentioned.
The result was over 8 years of high unemployment, poverty, deflation, and general misery in America. Van Buren disagreed with his Congress on how to fix the banking crisis, and Congress didn't allow his solution to the economic crisis to go into effect until 1840. His whole term was a mess of scandals, controversies, internal disagreements that was far more than Van Buren could control. He would fail to win re-election and spend the rest of his life trying unsuccessfully to get back into power so he could make up for his failures. And I think that's, poetic. Slightly less so than number 9, William Henry Harrison. So, William Henry Harrison, he's the fun fact president, right? He's famous for being the guy who died 31 days into office, which is about 75% of a Liz Truss. Yes, it's funny that he decided to give an inauguration speech into a blizzard, only to catch a cold and die. I bet you guys were thinking, oh, what are they going to do for William Henry Harrison? There's no way they could do a thing for William Henry Harrison because he just caught a cold and died. How, is that the incompetence? Oh, that's so obvious. Oh, you guys are all fucking hacks. No! I'm good at this! See, his death, the reason it was such a big deal is because his death was politically catastrophic. See, Harrison was the first president from the new Whig Party. Remember I said that Van Buren and Jackson basically formed the first political party? Well, this is the party put together to match that political party. These are the guys who were fighting with Van Buren in Congress, making his life hell. And the Whigs are a weird political movement in history. I kind of want to do an entire episode on them. This is going to be kind of half an episode on them, frankly. They feel very incoherent, as they were a coalition of politicians brought together only to oppose the Democrats. See, Van Buren's strategy, what made the Democrats powerful, was to marry his New York political machine with Southern slave interests, while Jackson could represent the West as he was from Tennessee, which was in the West at the time. You gotta remember, as is Ohio, this is 1840.
Yeah. Now, the Whigs were also geographically diverse, and their platform was basically just the opposite of whatever Andrew Jackson did. And that was the problem, because things like westward expansion and killing the national bank were popular. Because there was no regional unity, no one could decide who to run as president. So in 36, the Whigs ran 4 separate candidates for office in the bid to throw the election to the House like in 24, And that was the thing about the Whigs, is that they were the dominant coalition in Congress, but not really a political party on the national stage. This didn't work, of course, because it was a terrible and stupid plan. And we're kind of shocked that they didn't teach this in school, because it's probably the funniest election.
Well, when I found this, I was like, what? Wait. What?
You said splitting your vote amongst 4 candidates did not work.
This is like the ultimate, like, light Yagami 400 IQ plan that turns out to be awful. I don't know why they thought that was going to work in 36. But then the economy shits the bed under Van Buren, and the Whigs have this big shot to win. But there's still the problem of who to nominate. See, even if all the regional powers work together, all of the known most powerful Whigs, Daniel Webster, Henry Clay, these guys are known political figures. They were famous for long congressional debates and shady backroom deals. They were not clean. Harrison was the solution. He was born a Virginian but lived in Ohio. He had briefly held political office, but was solely focused on Ohio political interests as the state was setting itself up. And most importantly, he was a war hero who was nationally loved. You gotta have a war hero if you want to, run the country. Because we have this weird system where, the country needs to be ruled, but everyone who rules the country, everybody hates them. They're politicians. So, if you want a mass murderer? You like the mass murderer? We put the mass murderer in charge. Yeah. That was Harrison's thing. He was the quarterback who would carry the ball of the Whigs' political agenda into the end zone.
Yeah. And, this is historically significant because Harrison is the first real attempt to find a new Washington, a military figure who was beyond politics and therefore negated its sin. Now, a lot of people would say, what about Andrew Jackson? But that's not exactly correct. Jackson had political ambitions early on in his military career. He conducted this career to further his said ambitions, and he was a longtime politician before becoming president. Harrison, on the other hand, was basically an empty shell, a political ship ready to be piloted by the Whig Party. He had been one of the 4 candidates in 36, but now it would all be his, and he played along because why wouldn't you play along when somebody wants to make you president? It's kind of funny how most sources on Harrison just kind of gloss over his, opinions and beliefs.
He is a man who existed, but I could find 0 testaments to him liking things or disliking things or wanting things. I mean, I guess he advocated for Ohio. I mean, he's an Ohioan, all right? What do you expect him to be interesting for?
Yeah, the most interesting thing I remember about him, besides the dying thing, is just Tippy Canoe and Tyler too as his slogan.
We're getting there.
Yeah. So Harrison wins the 1840 election in the landslide with 80% turnout, and now he's going to have a long term where the Whigs can establish themselves and get popular and use their influence to build power under the stately gaze of, oh wait, he's dead.
Number 10, John Tyler. So Tyler is a big reason why the Whig Party didn't work out, and his failing is that he was a libertarian weirdo who didn't get along with anybody. This is the guy who didn't expand state power guy. You're gonna dislike him. Unlike Harrison, Tyler was a fully political figure. He was a lawyer before turning 20. He was elected to Virginia Congress at 21 and to National Congress at 26, at which time he was, of course, very wealthy and owned over 30 slaves. Come on, who do you think does that kind of thing? This guy was what we would now call a strict constructionist. He was one of the first, the Constitution says you can't do that, guys.
The Constitution doesn't say that.
And eventually he comes into conflict with the rest of the Democrats because he thought that things like the Missouri Compromise and extra tariffs were unconstitutional. And everyone's like, does the Thomas Jefferson thing of, come on, man, it's a country. We gotta run this thing. And he's like, well, I'm plenty happy in my slave plantation. I don't know why y'all have to change things. And by 1834, Tyler hates Jackson and all the things he did. Remember, Jackson is the guy who stood up to South Carolina when they tried to do the states' rights thing, which Tyler didn't like. Again, he's the states' rights, limited government, constitutional guy. So he hates Jackson. And who else hates Jackson? That's right, the Whigs. So Tyler is the vice presidential nominee for one of those 4 Whig candidates in 36. But again, that was just because they needed a guy, and he was literally just a politician they could get. And he remains a thorn in the Democrat side, and after the party nominated Harrison, they chose Tyler as his running mate so that slave-owning Southerners could balance the ticket. Tyler was literally an afterthought to the Whigs. They were running Harrison, the famed hero of the Battle of Tippecanoe. The campaign slogan was, as Jay spoiled like an idiot, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Tyler too. Sometimes they put Tyler too in parentheses. And why would they care about him? No president had ever died in office before. Tyler's just there to be there. Until he wasn't.
It turns out not even Harrison had been as easy to manipulate as the Whigs thought he would. During the transition to the presidency, Henry Clay had started picking out Harrison's cabinet, and Harrison had to step in and be like, hey buddy, who's the president here? So even he had a limit to how much backseat driving he would allow. And Tyler, unlike Harrison, actually has opinions about things and lots of legislative experience. This means that just a few months into the presidency, Tyler is already vetoing bills from his own party. Whig leaders had dreams of shaping the country through popular legislation and using federal appointments to create a national patronage network, but Tyler would have none of it. Just a brief aside, nowadays we expect when, if a Democrat becomes president, they replace all the top guys and all the agencies and all with Democrats. And same thing if a Republican. That wasn't really established early on. A lot of these guys would just inherit bureaucrats from the predecessor and just keep them around. But yeah. So Tyler also killed banking reforms. He killed tariffs. By his second year, some congressmen were already trying to impeach him. Congress was trying to undercut him at every step. His foreign policy, his investigatory powers, just everything. His cabinet was a revolving door of secretaries quitting and Tyler failing to get new ones nominated. It was a bit of a shit show, but just because the Whigs lost didn't mean Tyler won. He wanted to be elected to a second term, but there was no way the Whigs were going to nominate him. He also tried to go back to Democrats, but, they were kind of done with him. So he tried to run under his own party, the National Democrats, and while he tried to have a main campaign promise, he lacked a full party platform and even a vice president to run with. Tyler dropped out of the campaign in August to endorse the next guy we'll talk about, and he retired to continue being perhaps the least likable guy to ever become president. Seriously, this guy died a congressman for the Confederacy. Good riddance.
Spit on his name. Number 11, James K. Polk. Alright, Polk is weird. When I was putting together this list, Polk quickly became a problem. It's very easy to argue that he's the most competent president between Van Buren and Lincoln. Not a high bar there. But there's another argument that, depending on how you classify presidents, Polk is possibly the most competent president the United States ever had. See, Polk came in at a time when the Democrats were still fractured after the defeat of Van Buren. We talked about how the Whigs were a mess, but that doesn't mean the Democrats were any better. Polk kind of made all of the power players in the party happy. He was a dark horse, shall we say, going into the convention, and after they disagreed on a bunch of guys, everyone was like, well, what about Polk? And they were like, well, we can agree on Polk. He made all of the power players in the party happy. Van Buren, Jackson, Calhoun. In the national election, he was able to make his opponent, Henry Clay, look weak on the subject of annexing Texas and expanding territory. We are totally doing a Henry Clay episode at some point because, he gets talked up in your U.S. history class as a guy who was important, but he just ate shit constantly and was terrible at everything and was so dumb. Everything you know him from is him fucking up.
Yeah.
And he does not deserve to be thought of as one of the early American political greats.
Probably one of the most famous almost presidents in U.S. history, and almost because he kept on failing to become president.
So yeah, he makes his opponent, Henry Clay, look weak on the subject of annexing Texas and expanding the country. And once he won, he went to work on his sole obsession of expanding the borders of the country. Oregon was negotiated from the British. Texas was allowed to voluntarily join the Union, which, by the way, it always was going to do and always wanted to do, and that was the point from the beginning. It was never really its own country. It was just a collection of dudes. Fuck you. Then he deliberately provokes war with Mexico. The Mexican-American War was won quickly and gave America most of its continuous territory that we know today. The war was unjust and represented a massive violation of presidential authority, but that's both another episode and not the point.
Yeah, Polk was horny for land, and he got land. However, by the end of his term, he was trying to buy Cuba off of the Spanish. He only served one term because he had promised to only serve one term during his campaign. That had helped unify the party around him. You can argue that a lot of what he did was evil, but it doesn't take away from the fact that Polk got in, did what he wanted to do, and got out. Not much incompetence to find. So, instead we thought we'd be classy and just insult his physical appearance. If you don't know what Polk looks like, please look up a picture of him now, both as an old man and a young man.
They're both heinous, but for completely different reasons. Alright, Polk looks like an inbred vampire.
Like a scary old man from an 80s coming-of-age film that got stuck in the Laffy Taffy machine.
It looks like his eyes are so sunk into his skull that they're scraping the base of his brain.
He looks like he was born with half the blood that a human needs.
He looks like he gets sexually excited from watching hamsters drown.
Like a Scooby-Doo villain that just had their mask ripped off.
Like the Addams family's racist uncle. Oh, and I didn't realize I made 2 sex jokes like he jacks off to armpits. The young pictures do look like he jacks off to armpits.
Yeah. You'll have to explain the next one to me, but this is something which I don't exactly know what
it looks like a pedophile who exclusively wears Crocs.
Is that a thing?
You look at a younger painting of James K. Polk and tell me he doesn't look like a pedophile who exclusively wears Crocs. You gotta read the vibes, Jay. Roasting someone is about vibes. All right, look at his older pictures. Okay, look at that 1,000-yard stare. Okay, look at that high collar, of course, trying to conceal the old bite marks on his neck that turned him into a vampire. Look at that cheek crease. Okay.
Andrew Jackson.
Only people horny for genocide have that kind of cheek crease. Okay. This man does not like music, okay? This dude's favorite instrument is whistling, okay? He's a whistler, all right? You can just fucking see it in his eyes, all right? Even before his hair started receding, but he couldn't go full bald. This is a man who was president of the United States and decided to wear a mullet.
You know, kind of got to respect that.
Yeah, honestly, that's the coolest thing about him. You want to move on to Zachery Taylor?
All right, sure. Now, Zachery Taylor is a testament to the absurdity of the office of the President of the United States, who is almost completely apolitical military officer for most of his life, but the Mexican-American War made him a hero of national acclaim. You know, he stepped off the battlefield, and the politician immediately asked him if he wanted to run for the highest office in the land, so he did. Taylor was the Whig Party's second shot. Their next Harrison, and essentially the same thing played out again. Taylor's gonna die, the vice president's gonna be weird, and we're not gonna go over this story again.
Instead, let's talk about why our country has a guy who doesn't want to be president. Taylor was practically bullied into running for office, okay? Both parties want him to run. He just, chose the Whigs. On the campaign, he totally disregarded the Whig platform. I've read one historian pitch this as him being artfully ambiguous. But, I don't know. That sounds like giving him too much credit. This is a guy who never voted before voting for himself. I'll bet he just didn't have a lot of opinions on things before becoming president. And that his opinions were weird. Like, he supported slavery but didn't want to expand it into the territories. Not for any moral reasons. He just didn't think it would economically work for some reason. This outsider energy made him a weird man in office. He barely spoke to his vice president. He had no experience in foreign affairs and wound up both being accidentally offended by and offending several foreign dignitaries. He bucked his own party and refused to work with the men who put him in power. Why is this guy president? Why is this guy, who seems to have no experience or desire to do the job, president? How did the system produce this? Well, I think it comes from our system encouraging the existence of only two political parties. First past the post voting and whatnot. If you split from your party to make a new one, you're basically ensuring a party you like even less is going to win. So everyone goes into two parties. But then those two parties become coalitions filled with people who can barely get along, so they're forced to nominate someone everyone can agree on, who happens to be an outsider with no political experience. You just create a dude who embodies the party and put the skin of a handsome general over it. And that has the benefit of connecting to the lower class, most of whom are too busy working for a living to have nuanced political opinions. And some will argue that that's what Joe Biden is, to which I say that Joe Biden is different because he wanted to be president. He prepared for the job. And there are many reasons that America collapsed into civil war. And one of them is that the system of elections and weak parties put men at the helm who were completely unequipped to govern the nation. If you look at 1840 to 1860, America looks like fucking Italy.
Yeah.
With the amount of leaders it's churning and burning through. It's this is obviously not going to be stable. This is one of the reasons why we have so many presidents, is that so many of them fucking die or only serve one term.
Yeah. On the whole general note, I don't know if you remember this, but I'm kind of old enough to remember when, there were some people, mostly just, weird newspaper opinion columnists who really wanted David Petraeus to run for president, and were the Democrats or the Republicans, depending on the writer. Who in the
sweet name of Monica is David Petraeus?
Petraeus was the American general in charge of the Iraq surge. And the surge was seen as being effective. And
famously a great idea.
I mean, let's just say that it temporarily was effective and made David Petraeus very popular for a while. And people were going, the party should run David Petraeus. He'll be the next Eisenhower or whatever. And obviously that went completely, nowhere, because Petraeus then got involved in a very dumb political scandal. And yeah, this whole idea of just get the popular general to run has never gone away. It's just that nowadays we don't really have that many popular generals.
Good.
And that brings us to Millard Fillmore. So yeah, Fillmore is just another vice president for the Whigs who was put on the ticket to balance things out, but then couldn't be controlled once he was president. We don't really want to talk about that, and you probably aren't that interested in hearing about that. So let's talk about how Fillmore and his successors paved the way for the Civil War. Now, you'd be forgiven for thinking that the U.S. went from having westward expansion as its biggest issue to slavery being the major political divide. But that ignores the fact that debates over westward expansion were also debates over slavery, and should the new states allow the practice or not. Once Tyler and Polk were done grabbing land, it was left to Taylor and Fillmore to sort out what to do with that. Fillmore personally oversaw these debates as he presided the Senate as vice president. And once in office, Fillmore passed the Compromise of 1850, which he was heavily involved in.
The debates of 1850 made it clear that war was coming. Southern states had grumbled about secession during Taylor's administration, which he personally responded to with threats. Like 11 years before the Civil War, you have Southern states threatening secession openly. Free states clamored for slavery to be opposed, but their concerns, which Fillmore represented, were ignored. Instead, Fillmore, the scion of Buffalo, New York, personally pressured Northern Whigs to give Southerners everything they wanted, including the Fugitive Slave Act, which overrode the laws of free states that did not wish for slavery within their borders. See, to politicians like Millard here, slavery was not a problem because it was evil. It was a problem because it caused division. Fillmore would live a long time, write a lot of stuff after being president, and if you follow his line of logic on the issue of slavery, he essentially resented the slaves for existing. They were an annoyance to him, a problem to solve. If they weren't around, life would be so much easier. Fillmore did not want to fight a debate over slavery. He wanted to hush the baby back to sleep and then kick the can down the road. That's why the Great Compromise, so-called Great Compromise of 1850, said nothing about slavery in territories like New Mexico, Utah, and Kansas. And he was drawing from the main political logic of his day.
See, the prevailing theory at the time was that you had to run for president as a moderate on slavery. Fillmore was a Northerner who respected the institution. Taylor was a slave owner who believed it shouldn't spread west. Our next two presidents will also be Northerners who respected slavery. The idea was that both presidential candidates would have moderate opinions on slavery, which would allow the election to be run on different issues.
I must mention that moderate is put in quotes. Jay, you gotta learn how to, do the in quotes voice.
You know.
This is episode 35 of the podcast.
Just gotta see both sides of the issue. Yeah, this was because the slave-owning South was the largest individual voting bloc. You couldn't win the presidency with just the South, but you also couldn't win without them. Well, unless the party combined Northern abolitionist sentiment with Western populism, but that would be crazy. Anyways, dudes like Fillmore desperately wanted to get away from slavery as an issue and distract the American public with another axis of politics. For Fillmore, that was anti-Catholic sentiment, and he later tried to get back into office running on the ticket of the Know Nothing Party. And of course, none of the efforts by Fillmore and the other elites to ignore the problems of slavery made it go away, and the Civil War happened regardless. Thanks for nothing.
Millard Fillmore is the president that looks the most like he would be full-time on Twitter. Number 14, Franklin Pierce. I don't want to talk much about Pierce because by the time he got into office, the country was just on rails towards the Civil War. Now, Pierce didn't help on that front. He placated the Southerners even more than Fillmore did. Because there was absolutely no other political theory on what to do. It was just, you smash the button of placate Southerners, placate Southerners, placate Southerners. Pierce oversaw bleeding Kansas and sat on his hands while thousands of Americans fought over whether the territories of Kansas and Nebraska would be slave or free in battles that left over 200 dead. Like, we think about clashes between, say, Antifa and Proud Boys or far-right militias. These days are violent, but those have killed, like, a handful of people, and there's been like 4 cases of brief exchanges of gunfire. All right, these are pitched battles that are just happening over there out west. Pierce moved to recognize a pro-slavery government in Kansas, even though it was clearly a sham. And he did this not so much for his own political reasons, but because, like Fillmore, he just wanted everyone to shut up. Pierce was not a Whig. He was a Democrat, and his presidency was evidence of the Democrats failing to square the circle of antebellum politics. He was a senator from New Hampshire that did not oppose slavery. Obviously, he would say that, he opposed it on his personal moral grounds, but as far as the law is concerned, the Constitution is clear that we cannot interfere. And he was nominated by the Democrats after several rounds of argument. The party itself was divided on its exact position on slavery, and Pierce was a compromise between moderates and hardliners. He was shocked to even be offered his job. So Pierce's term embodies the collapse of the Democrats, and it's the collapse of the Democrats, this is often forgotten, that really kicks off the Civil War. He spends the first 2 months of his term personally appointing hundreds of low-level bureaucrats, trying to balance every Democrat faction and avoid offending anybody. The pro-slavery folks are mad? Okay, I'll recognize the government in Kansas. Oh, the anti-expansion folks are mad? Then we won't try and buy Cuba. And for all his efforts, Pierce is punished at every turn. The slavery debate only grows more heated. His party loses spectacularly in the midterms, and at the end of his term, Pierce receives the final humiliation.
For all of his efforts at holding an impossible coalition together and placating the radicals, they wouldn't even do him the decency of giving him another term. It wasn't universal, but the majority of Democratic leadership thought that Pierce was too politically toxic and chose James Buchanan to run in his place. This grants Pierce the designation as the only president in American history who sought the party's renomination and did not receive it. What a loser. I think it just goes to show the fact that if something's a terrible idea, it doesn't matter how well you execute it. And that brings us to that guy who is definitely not politically toxic, James Buchanan. Now, we've been going on and on about how the run-up to the Civil War is coming for a while now. Buchanan is rightly on most lists of the worst presidents ever for his role in starting the Civil War. And while that shade is rightly justified, I think we've made it clear by now that by the time Buchanan got into office, the country was on the rails to sail off of a cliff. Detrained sail. Anyways.
All right, listen, this was written on like at least 40 milligrams of Adderall and like several synthwave playlists. I got it written.
Just imagining
listen, you could throw shade when you write more of these entries than I have.
Now, the Democratic Party would fall into disarray, the Republicans would rise, and threatened by a prospect of a president who held even slightly negative views on slavery, the South rebelled. Buchanan obviously helped this along, and this is well known. Generally, this is what most people learn about in school, so we thought it would be fun to bring up a rarely discussed episode of his presidency, pivot away from slavery, and wait a minute, Azalea, what exactly are we talking about?
Mormons.
Mormons?
Mormons. we don't talk enough about violence between Christian denominations in the United States. Like, we just had Millard Fillmore trying to have an entire party basically based on hating the Catholics and the Irish. But it was a huge, massive current of American history is persecuting Christian denomination religious minorities. I mean, that's where the whole fire in a crowded theater thing comes from, and a lot of our Supreme Court cases about freedoms of speech and whatnot in the 1900s. But anyway, the early decades of Mormonism saw straight up battles between average Americans and the Church of Latter-day Saints. If you are, I mean, there are Mormons outside of America, but they're one of the fastest growing branches, denominations of Christianity. But I don't know, to our many Paraguayan, New Zealand, and Taiwanese listeners, Mormonism is a branch of Christianity started in like 1820 or so by this guy named Joseph Smith. And many have argued that it is a uniquely American religion. Some people have said it's kind of American supremacy as a religion. It takes very massive breaks from Christianity. It's based on it, but it kind of recenters the religion on Americanism and American ideals. Some have gone so far as to say it's not. It's a separate religion from Christianity. You can quibble on all sorts of things. But anyway, Joseph Smith's wildly successful cult was chased from Pennsylvania to Ohio to Missouri to Illinois. Every local population was less than thrilled about the Mormons moving in, and Smith was eventually killed in Illinois after a cycle of increasingly militant tensions in the town of Nauvoo. This is all very interesting. You can learn about it somewhere else. Maybe we'll have a whole episode on it one day. Go ahead and take a shot every time we say that, by the way, throughout this series. Anyway, Smith dies, and the Mormons decide they need to go where no one could oppose them, and they migrated out west, all the way to Utah, being led by this guy named Brigham Young. Now, this is one of my favorite, concepts of American history. And Jay, maybe we'll talk about it a bit, but, during the 1850s, the U.S. legally owned Utah, after the Mexican-American War. But that was just lines on a map. The country had no control over the territory. It couldn't effectively enforce its will or laws. The Mormons moved in, settled around the Salt Lakes, fought with local Indian tribes, and built a community and government in Utah. So, for a few decades, Utah functionally was an independent theocratic nation that swore allegiance to the United States, which some would argue is not too different from today. But back then it was way more obvious. But before the two groups were buddy-buddy, there was a period of rising tensions between both truth and rumor that culminated in Buchanan sending federal troops into Utah. Jay, before you begin your section, I wrote all this, but I think you should look into this war. Wars. I think you would find it pretty fascinating.
Quite possibly. The Mormons are interesting. I'll admit that I'm not a Mormonism expert, but it's a interesting part of American history. But yeah, the Utah War was, as you mentioned, a blundering affair and from front to back. Buchanan had deployed federal troops on nebulous orders based on rumors that he did not confirm. These troops also lacked adequate supplies for the following winter. This war wasn't exactly dignified. There were no formal battles. Both sides basically wandered around the Utah prairies harassing each other. The Mormons burnt supply lines. The feds stole cattle and raided farms. Without proper lines of communication and supply, both troops in the field and civilians at home feared the worst and perpetrated rumors of mass violence. Eventually, Buchanan realized how much of a mess it all was and sent a separate commission to negotiate peace. This team met with Brigham Young, and before long, Buchanan called the whole thing a misunderstanding, issued a blanket pardon in Utah, and ordered troops to stand down. He was pressured to wrap things up because of how widely mocked he was for this affair, with it even being called Buchanan's blunder.
And thus the Utah War ended peacefully without consequences. Well, except for the Mormons murdering at least 120 settlers from Arkansas who were moving through the territory. But don't worry, guys, the Mormon tradition of gunning down unarmed civilians is still being upheld as recently as November of 2022 in Colorado Springs. Moving on to a much lighter topic, the Civil War.
Just gonna add it onto the list, add it onto the tweet longer. The cancel document. Wonder how many pages it's at now. I should check that someday.
If you don't laugh, you cry, folks. If you don't laugh, you cry. And I cry a lot. Number 16, Abraham Lincoln.
Obviously, most of Lincoln's presidency is wrapped up in the Civil War, which we've talked about before and will talk about a lot in the future extensively. This war has its ups and downs, most of which aren't really involved with Lincoln, so it's hard to find a clear incompetence on that front. Most people are going to bring up Lincoln's suspension of civil liberties, or other wartime unpleasantries, but while researching for the Utah War, we also found a much funnier story. You see, in 1862, America was not only fighting a war, but working with a Congress dominated by one party, the Republicans, because, most of the others left. So the Republicans got to pass everything they wanted to pass, with one of those laws being the oft-forgotten Moral Anti-Bigamy Act of 1862. This actively banned marrying more than one person at once in America's federal territories and was directly aimed at the Mormons out in Utah. Because, again, while these days Mormons are a regular part of America, back in the 1860s they were very controversial and actively suppressed.
Now, the Civil War wasn't exactly going swimmingly for the Union in '62. And Lincoln didn't need his Congress picking fights with the states and territories that weren't already in revolt. So Lincoln chose not to enforce the Anti-Bigamy Act, and through some sort of roundabout communication, essentially told Brigham Young that he wasn't enforcing the act in exchange for Utah staying out of the war. It's a funny and mildly important moment of realpolitik, where Lincoln undercut his own Congress. And honestly, realpolitik is something that Lincoln should be more associated with in general, as well as being, the GOAT.
Yeah.
Jay, you didn't know any Mormons growing up?
Oh, my neighbors growing up were Mormons, but I don't know, I didn't talk much about religion with them.
I had several friends and classmates growing up who were Mormons. In my experience, either the obscenely nicest people you'll ever meet, or so mean they will actively make it their life's work to ruin you. I even knew some people who converted to Mormonism. And again, one of them, very cool, very normal. You kind of wondered why she'd do it. The other one, and for legal reasons, I better not tell that story.
Yeah.
I remember my first semester at University of Georgia. As a college student, one of the things you learn is how to refuse people trying to hand you something. Earbuds in, sunglasses on, you just act like they're not even there. And I'll never forget the Mormons trying to hand out. Now, obviously, everyone knows that Jesus wasn't white, but he's generally depicted the same way. But Mormons have the blonde-haired, blue-eyed Jesus. I remember they were handing out. And I'm like, don't come at me with no master race Jesus.
I just remember reading Arthur Conan Doyle's A Study in Scarlet, which is the first ever Sherlock Holmes, story, and it's like,
for some reason, one of the
to the
things that
second
don't
part,
make it
and it's
into
like-
adaptations
all
is
the
like
Mormons.
is like if you read the book, like 60 fucking pages where the novel just stops and is a completely separate story about Mormons in Utah, which is very violent and raucous and scandalizing, and slams back into the normal plot, which is about highly armed Mormons, which always made me laugh as a kid.
It's definitely not something I was expecting.
No, but when Arthur Conan Doyle was writing, like, Mormons kind of were, like, potentially, if you were to exaggerate things, as all novels at the time did, a highly armed group of religious terrorists living in the American West.
Yeah, for sure.
And I just think it's wild that there's this period of American history where, like, we claim to own all this land, but there's people who are just out there and they can kind of do whatever they want because it's really hard to stop them.
Yeah.
And you have this mixture between Mormons being legitimately religiously persecuted in America and subject to a lot of awful stuff. They're kind of just minding their own business and, want to be citizens of the United States, balanced with the fact that sometimes they are getting up to some fucky shit. And if you're wondering, because Mormons are kind of famous for the polygamy thing, essentially there was I'm not super familiar on the process, but there was a series of negotiations over the course of the 1870s and 80s and 90s that eventually ended with Utah becoming a state, and the Mormon government essentially cut a deal with the feds where they agreed to Mormonism has patches. The leader of Mormonism can I think it's called like the prophet can just like say, oh hey, we're allowed to drink caffeine now, which I think was a thing that happened in like 2012 or something like that. Yeah, so they said, okay, we're gonna chill with the polygamy if you don't enforce it on anyone who's currently married to multiple people. And that is how Utah was able to become a state without leading to a massive crisis of everyone in power being a felon.
Or just making polygamy legal in the United States.
Which is another thing they could have done. Not gonna comment on that. Frankly, I kind of don't care. I don't know. Yeah. You ready to keep going, Jay?
Sure.